So any questions from the last class? Okay, so the way we would structure today's lecture is as follows. I still had some stuff left over from yesterday's lecture, so I'll just finish that. Then I will go over to the content of today's lecture, which essentially would focus on some algorithms. So, we've been essentially dealing with the theoretical aspects of networks and talking about network metrics in somewhat of a theoretical manner, but often the challenge lies in calculating it for the particular network you are interested in. So, how do you actually calculate clustering, path length, and so on? So, we would look at the nuts and bolts of a few algorithms for this, and then I'd hand the stage over to Chandrasekhar, who's sitting over here. So, he's a PhD student in computational biology. So, Chandrasekhar would be walking you through two network analysis software, Network X and Gephi, and would be giving you a demo of how you actually analyze a particular network. So, you can visually represent it, you can calculate various statistics, you can do operations like partitioning them into communities or modules and so on. So, he will essentially walk you through a few examples to show how this is done. It would have been ideal if you could have followed along in your computers while he's showing how it's done in Network X and Gephi, but it would take a bit of time to download the software. So, maybe what you could do is you could just follow along when he shows you how it's done, and then afterwards you could download the software and try it out on your own. If there are any issues, we can get Chandrasekhar to look through the particular issues you have and so on. Okay. All right. So, let's go back to where we stopped last time. So, in yesterday's lecture, we were looking at various network metrics like clustering, path length, degree, centrality, betweenness centrality, and so on. And we stopped at this point where we said that just as you could have local properties like clustering and so on, you could also look at similarity between nodes in terms of whether two nodes have essentially the same set of neighbors or a very similar set of neighbors. And I was mentioning that this is the kind of technique that is used to implement things like when you go to some kind of a website, the website says if you like product X, you would probably like product Y and Z. Okay? And so they do this by essentially constructing a network of preferences of the different customers based upon what they have clicked on over the past several years, and then by looking at what you have clicked on and trying to find users who have clicking patterns similar to yours, they try to predict what you are likely to click eventually. So, this is very much an idea which essentially arises from perusal of networks. Okay. Now, all the metrics that I mentioned to you were essentially for unsigned networks, where the links essentially have no sign associated with them. So, qualitatively they are all identical. But as I was mentioning in previous lecture, in biology often you have links which are qualitatively different. So, some links could be positive, that is they are activatory or excitatory in nature. So, whoever they link to, they tend to make further excited or further activated. Or you could have a link which has a negative sign associated with it, that is it's inhibitory or inactivatory in nature. Okay. So, what about those kinds of networks? Are there measures which are specific for signed networks? Of course, you can go and measure all these different things like path length, clustering, similarity, centrality for all of these signed networks. but is there some specific network measure which is unique to these kinds of signed networks? It turns out that a very important property associated with signed networks is the phenomenon of balance, or as it's often called, structural balance. So this was a idea which was first conceived of by Fritz Heider, an Austrian Gestalt psychologist. And so what he was interested was essentially the structure of our social networks, or in particular the structure of how we form relations of friends and so on. And so he said that, look, if you look at a social network, oftentimes all triadic relations are not equally stable. And so the case he had in mind was, think of the following situation. So if you are considering all the possible relations that can exist between three individuals, let's just call them Om, Pradeep and Sinha. So then what are the different kinds of relations that can exist between them? Well, one of the simplest things you can think of is where they are all mutual friends. So everybody likes each other. Okay? You could also have situations where they all dislike each other. So they are all mutual enemies. Okay? And you could have something intermediate where, let's say, Om and Pradeep are friends, but both of them detest Sinha. Or you could have a situation where Pradeep and Sinha are both friends, Pradeep and Om are both friends of Sinha's, but Pradeep and Om just don't get along with each other. So these are all the 8 possible ways in which you can associate plus and minus signs with the links of a triad. Now, what Heider said was that if you look at these 8 possibilities, you would soon realize that some of these relations are stable, that is, they will be maintained over time. Other relations are unstable in the sense that it's unlikely that such a state of affairs will continue. Why? Well, if they're all friends, it's perfectly understandable that this will be very stable because they will continue to remain friends and so on. Okay. However, consider the following, that Pradeep and Om are friends of Sinha's, but they just don't get along with each other. In such a situation, there would be a tension, because suppose Pradeep wants to go to a party with Sinha, and Sinha of course wants to take Om along, but this leads to a tussle, okay? Because Pradeep just refuses to get on the same vehicle as Om. Okay? So at some point, something will happen, and eventually the situation would be resolved where, let's say, Pradeep manages to convince Sinha that Om is a very bad person, and you would end up with a situation like this, where Sinha now detests Om also. So now you have a very stable relation where Pradeep and Sinha are friends and they both hate Om. Okay? So that's a very stable situation. Okay? Now what happens when you have a situation where everyone is a mutual enemy? That's also an unstable situation, because suppose Pradeep wants to do some action A and the others just want to do opposite of what their enemies do. Now Sinha and Om are in a quandary because both want to do exactly the opposite thing of what Pradeep is doing. However, if both do essentially the same thing, they are essentially inadvertently agreeing with each other, which of course they hate to do. Okay? So they are wondering what to do, and of course we know that in many situations what happens is that you decide that, well, enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so eventually it can resolve to a situation like this, where even though Pradeep and Om dislike each other, maybe their mutual dislike of Sinha is so high that they decide to form a affiliative relationship. Okay? So Heider said that because of the underlying tensions of these kinds of triadic relationships, they would be unstable, and he called them unbalanced, whereas these relations would be fairly stable, and he called them balanced. So how do we frame it in mathematical terms? So we say that any triadic relationship where you have an odd number of minus signs is unbalanced. Okay? So this was put into some kind of a rigorous framework by two graph theorists, Cartwright and Harari in 1956, where they essentially extended this to all kinds of cycles beyond just 3 node triads. So they said that if you have a general network, then you will call it balanced if every possible cycle, that is every closed loop, is balanced. That is, if you look at the product of all the signs of the links in such a cycle, the product will be positive. That's just another way of saying that you would have an even number of links having minus sign associated with it. Okay. Furthermore, they said that if you are looking at a complete graph, that is where every node is connected to every other node, then you don't even have to look at anything beyond 3 cycles. If all the 3 cycles are balanced, or in other words, they're one of these 4 types, so each and every one of them belongs to one of these 4 types, then automatically the entire network is also balanced. So you don't have to look at 4 cycles, 5 cycles, and so on. Okay? And a consequence of this is that if the whole network is balanced, you can just partition it into 2 groups. Within each group, you only have plus relations, and between the 2 groups, you only have minus relations. Or in other words, you can just take a balanced network and divide it into 2 parts. Within each group, you will have nodes which only have plus relations, and within this group, you also have nodes which have plus relations, and between them, you have negative relations. Okay? So this is essentially following from the definition of a balanced network. If you have a balanced network where every 3 cycle is balanced, that is, it has only 0 or even number of minus signs, automatically you can show that such a network can be partitioned into 2 such groups. Okay. Now, what's the consequence of this? Essentially, this means that you can quickly come up with a dynamical state of the network which is consistent with the signs that you associate between every pair of nodes. Now, why is this of interest? Well, people have applied the concept of structural balance beyond the purely social relations of individual setting that Heidegger originally proposed to, and applied to all kinds of places. Okay? So, one particular innovative application of structural balance is in the realm of international relations. So, this particular network is the Alliance Network of Nations circa 1962. So, if you were born in the Cold War era, many of these groupings would be very familiar to you. NATO, of course, is still around. Warsaw Pact was essentially the opposite of NATO. So, this was basically the grouping of countries which fell under the influence of the erstwhile USSR. And you had other groupings like, for example, the Arab League, the Organization of African Unity, and the Organization of American States, which are of course still around, if not so active. Now, what is of interest is that these groupings essentially arise in an almost self-organized fashion if you take into account the kind of relationships that these nations have among them in terms of treaties that they have signed with each other. So, essentially the network links correspond to treaties that countries have essentially signed with each other. This could be a bilateral treaty or this could be a multilateral treaty, and you would see that essentially this results in the occurrence of certain clusters which can be identified with, in some cases, with well-known groupings like that of NATO, Arab League, and so on. Now, others have taken this idea to an even more interesting point. So, there's a bit of work done by Sidney Redner and his collaborators at Boston, where they constructed a similar network of relations among the countries in Europe prior to the outbreak of the First World War, and showed that if you look at how this network of relations between various countries evolved from 1900 to 1914, you would see that essentially it started from a network which was balanced to a gradually increasing unbalance, and eventually war happens at the situation where there is maximum unbalance in the network, and after the war the balance is restored. So this led them to conclude that when you have deviation from balance in a network, that creates tension in the network, and eventually there is a catastrophic event like a war or whatever, until you have a reorganization of the network where again the balance state is restored. Now, if you are coming from physics, this is not very surprising, because structural balance essentially for physical systems corresponds to the condition of no frustration. Okay? So what do I mean by frustration? So consider the workhorse of statistical physics, namely a spin system. Okay? So if you are not familiar with spin systems, let me just describe it very briefly. So spin models were originally proposed to explain the occurrence of magnetic systems or magnetism, and Ising back in the early 20th century had proposed this very simple model where he said that, look, I can view a magnet as essentially comprising a large number of tiny magnetic spins, and which interact with the neighboring spins. Now each spin can be in one of two states, up or down, and depending upon the relation that they have with their neighbors, they either all like to align in the same direction, or they like to align in opposite direction. So if the relationship between two spins is positive, the spins would like to align in the positive direction. Now spoken in terms of physics, this means that you can write down an energy function where the energy decreases if the spins are in the same orientation. So if both spins are +1 or both spins are -1, that contributes to a decrease in the energy function. On the other hand, if the relationship is negative, for example in antiferromagnets, then what happens is that the spins prefer to be in opposite orientations, or in other words, the corresponding term in the energy function will be such that if one is +1 and the other is -1, that contributes to a decrease in energy, but if they are both in the same orientation, then that results in an increase in the energy function. Now you might think that why is this of interest beyond let us say the specific context of magnetism in which it was originally proposed. It turns out that such spin models have an extreme generality, so much so that it has been applied in all kinds of domains: biology, social sciences, computer science, and so on. Any system in which you can think of your entity as essentially having two possible states that it can lie in. Okay? So if you are interested in a social setting, you could say that I am interested in opinion of a population about a let us say a situation where they could be in one of two possible opinions. So it could be some kind of a referendum where you are voting yes or no about a particular political issue. Okay? Or it could be, for example, a genetic network where the individual nodes are genes, and it could be either in a on state or off state. So on state means that it is creating proteins at the maximum possible rate, and off means essentially protein production has stopped or is occurring at an extremely negligible rate. Okay? So now if you map any system that you are interested in where the individual nodes can be in at any point of time one of two possible states, that is you have essentially binary state nodes, to such a situation, then if your network has links which are signed, so for example the genetic network, the sign essentially correspond to whether a particular gene promotes the expression of another gene or inhibits the expression of another gene. So essentially you can associate a plus or a minus sign with every relation in the genetic network. Or in the social setting, this could be, for example, that you could have groups of people who have affiliative relations or antagonistic relations with others. So again, you can associate a plus or minus. Or if you're interested in neural networks, you could say that essentially the up state corresponds to the neuron firing and the down state corresponds to the neuron not firing. And the plus and the minus relations of the networks of the links then correspond to excitatory synaptic interaction and inhibitory synaptic interaction. In all such situations, you can view the evolution of the state of the network simply in terms of such a spin model. So that gives us enormous powerful tool to you to study such complex systems in terms of a very simple physical object. Okay, so now if you have a situation like this, it's easy to see that this is a situation where the energy would be minimized. On the other hand, if you have a situation like this where the links are all negative, you have a situation which leads to somewhat of a puzzling situation. Why? Well, suppose you are given a triad where each link is negative and you are trying to find a spin orientation which would be consistent with these signs. So you say that, okay, I'll put a down spin here. Because the relationship is negative, this has to be up. Now you come to this one. So if you just look at the negative relation it has with this one, you would say it should be down, but at the same time it has a negative relationship with this down spin and so it should be up. And so here you have two conflicting constraints. According to its relationship with this spin, it should be down. According to its relationship with this spin, it should be up. It cannot simultaneously satisfy both constraints, and this leads to what we term as frustration. Okay? So what frustration does is that it says that you cannot achieve the lowest possible energy of the system under such conditions. So you end up with multiple energy minima, none of which are the lowest possible energy minima you could have got if there was no frustration. And you end up with lots of low-lying energy minima which are all more or less equivalent. Okay? Now, interestingly, it turns out that it is the creation of such multiple minima, none of which are in some sense the global minima, which leads precisely to the occurrence of computationally hard problems. So, for example, you can map a traveling salesman problem into such a spin system, and you can show that the corresponding energy landscape would look pretty much rugged like this. And this is precisely why solving a traveling salesman problem is difficult. So you cannot, for example, take the approach where you just locally try to find the best possible itinerary by just going as follows. So you come to city 1 and you say, which city can I go from here at the least possible cost? So you go to that city, and then from that point you say, which is the city I can go at the least possible cost, and so on. So this is called local minimization, pretty similar to what Professor Nerlich was mentioning in her first or second lecture actually maybe. And you think that such a local minimization might work, but the reason it breaks down is because in a situation where you have many possible solutions, none of which are the global solution, what will happen is if you do such local optimization, because you don't know where you start from, you would get stuck at a good solution but not quite the most optimal one. Okay? If on the other hand you had a situation like this, okay, where there was no frustration, your energy landscape will just have a single minima, in which case a local gradient descent like algorithm would work perfectly. So you just keep doing finding the local the solution which will give you locally the best possible solution, and you would eventually reach the global optima. Okay? So it's the occurrence of frustration in the network corresponding to such computationally hard problems which essentially makes them computationally hard. Now, all the examples of structural balance that I mentioned essentially occur in the context of social sciences. So, what about biology? So, is there evidence that structural balance is an important concept in biology? Okay. It turns out that there is indirect evidence, at least in neuroscience, that structurally balanced networks may be the norm. So, for example, in work carried out in 2005, people looked at the activity of different brain regions imaged in terms of functional MRI and found that if you look at the activity state of a large number of regions, essentially they divide into two groups where whenever one set of brain regions is highly active, the other set of brain regions has very low levels of activity. So, essentially if you look at your structural balance theory, you would immediately realize that what this corresponds to is spontaneous segregation of the network into two groups, where within each group you have strong positive relation and between two groups you have negative relations. So, the occurrence of such a functional network of brain regions implies that structural balance is implicit in the dynamical brain networks. But more concretely, Uri Alon's group has looked at unbalanced motifs in the context of genetic regulatory circuits. And here, of course, the complexity lies because now not only do you have networks associated with signs, the links also have arrows associated with them. Okay. So, you have to generalize the concept of structural balance to directed networks. So, this of course was already done by Cartwright and Harari back in the 50s. So, they said that look, if you are thinking of directed networks, instead of thinking of cycles, one should also include semi-cycles. So, what are semi-cycles? So, for example, a feed-forward loop in the language of Uri Alon would be an example of a semi-cycle. So, a cycle would be one, for example, where x would give an arrow to z, z will give an arrow to y, and y would give an arrow to x, so that you have a directed loop. But in a semi-cycle, you could have a situation where x gives an arrow all the way to z, and x also has an indirect path to z via y. So, this would correspond to a semi-cycle. Now, if you look at all the possible semi-cycles of this triad of nodes, you would realize that you could have balanced or unbalanced semi-cycles. So, what are balanced semi-cycles? So, you would see that in all of these situations, whenever you have some state, either up or down, or some low or high state in x, it's consistent. You can consistently assign states in all the other nodes. So, for example, here you could easily say that look, if x is in the high state, or in binary parlance, if you say x is in 1, essentially y would be in 1 or high state, and z also would be in 1 or high state. Okay. Now, come to something which is slightly more complicated. Here, if x is in high state, because it has an inhibitory relation with y, y would go into a low state, and because y has a positive relation with z, z would also be in a low state. What about the direct relation x has with z? It is a negative relation. So, since x is high, z should be low. So, you can see that both from the direct and the indirect paths, z is low and x is high. So, both of these paths are consistent with each other. Contrast this with an unbalanced semi-cycle, where if x is high over here, it makes y low. Y, because it has a negative relationship with z, now makes it high again. Okay. However, x has a negative relation with z, so x is trying to make z low. So, you can see along the direct path, x is trying to make z high, along the indirect path, it is trying to make it along the indirect path, it is trying to make it low, and along the indirect path, it is trying to make it high, which are inconsistent with each other. So, this leads to a frustration. Okay. So, you can see that the concept of frustration generalizes quite easily to the concept of semi-cycles. And so from this, Uri-Alon's group came up with the idea of two types of semi-cycles in the genetic regulatory circuit. This class, the balanced types, they call the coherent feed-forward loop, and the unbalanced type, they call the incoherent feed-forward loop. And they also attributed very specific functions to these two types. So if you look at the balanced situation, the coherent feed-forward loop, it turns out that they function primarily as detectors for sustained signals. And so the way they can work like that is as follows. So for example, think of this as X, this is Y, and Z over here. So suppose you give a signal to X, which is just a blip. Okay? So this signal traveling to Y essentially takes a bit of time. So by the time it comes to Y, it's already starting to decay. And then when you switch off the signal, essentially after some point Y also decays. Now Z, which is like a combination of the signals that it receives from X and Y, does not quite see this blip of a signal at all, because the two signals don't contribute together to create a supra-threshold signal. It's not able to exceed its threshold of detectability. On the other hand, if you give it a sustained signal, which is has this duration compared to this short duration over here, what happens is that Y, which is receiving the signal after a delay, now actually sees the signal, and then these two signals would add to each other to create a supra-threshold signal for Z, and so therefore it's able to recognize this sustained signal. So while it will not at all respond to a transient signal, it would respond to a sustained signal. On the other hand, an unbalanced triad would act as a novelty detector, or something which is capable of adapting to a sustained stimulation. Again, you can see that if you give a sustained signal to X, what happens is that X remains on for as long as you keep the signal on. Now X is giving the signal to Y, so Y essentially after a delay essentially starts showing a rise in its activity. Now what happens at Z? So Z first receives a signal from X, so it starts rising, but after a while it starts receiving this inhibitory signal from Y, and so this inhibitory signal cancels out this activatory signal, and so it starts to decay. So this essentially functions like an adaptation response, where you initially respond to a novel stimulus with some response, but if this stimulus continues, you adapt to it, and eventually you go back to the state where you were in your resting state when there was no stimulation. Okay. So using a judicious mix of balanced and unbalanced semi-cycles, the genetic regulatory circuit can actually make up quite complex logic circuits. Okay. So these semi-cycles are actually specific examples of motifs. So motifs are essentially small subnetworks, or patterns of connections between a small set of nodes within a network, which are occurring more frequently than what you expect from pure chance. And this essentially, like for example some of the other things that I talked about, like betweenness centrality and so on, is an example of a microscopic property of a network. Okay. So whenever you think of a network, realize that it could have properties which are manifested at very different scales. So they could have properties which are manifested at a macro scale. So these are like the global path length, the average clustering coefficient, the degree distribution, and so on, which are properties of the network as a whole. Or they could have microscopic properties, which are properties associated with individual nodes like centrality, or small sets of nodes like the occurrence of motifs. So what Alon's group did was they figured out a way of identifying such motifs, and the way they did it was like this. So they said that, look, if you look at all the possible patterns that you can make with connections between three nodes, these are all the different possibilities, right? So what you're asking is, are some of these patterns occurring in the network that you are interested in much more frequently than by chance? Now, how do you find that? So you would say that for this, I would need to know what is the random analog of the network I'm interested in. But if you just construct a random network, it's most likely to have properties which are anyway very different from the empirical network you are interested in. You would like to keep most of the features that are there in your empirical network intact when you create the analogous randomized network. So they suggested a very nice way of randomizing the empirical network you're interested in. So they said that, look, when you randomize a network, ideally you would like to keep the degree sequence of the network intact. So in other words, if in the original network node A had 10 connections, in the randomized network node A also has 10 connections. What has changed simply is who those 10 connections connect with. Okay. Similarly, node B in the original network had 3 connections. In the randomized network also it has 3 connections, but who those 3 connections connect to has changed in the randomized network. So how do you do this? So they came up with quite a novel way of it, not very novel. I mean, if you think about it, it's actually quite simple. So they said that, look, think of the problem as follows. So in the original network, you have, let's say, a connection between A and B, and you have another connection between nodes C and D. Okay. Now the simplest way of randomizing is just to take a pair of such links, AB and CD, which don't have any mutual relations with them, and just swap those links. Okay. So originally we were connected from A to B and C to D. All you do is you now disconnect those links. So you have A to B, C to D. Okay. So what you do is you remove those links and you just connect like this. Now if you think a moment about it, this operation would leave the degree of the nodes unchanged. A had a connection starting out like this before you did the rewiring. Even now it has a connection starting out like this, and similarly for each of these other nodes. You have not changed the number of connections. What you have changed is who they connect to. Okay? And so if you are interested to know whether there are properties of the empirical network which cannot be explained simply by their degree sequence, one way you can find out is basically to construct such randomized networks which preserve the degree sequence, and then comparing the properties of such randomized networks with the network that you are interested in. Okay? And that is precisely what Alon did. So he said that, look, I construct many such randomized networks starting from my original network, and then I start counting how many of these 3 node subgraphs are there in these randomized networks compared to the actual count of the 3 node subgraphs in the empirical network. Okay. And in this way, if I find that some of these motifs occur more frequently in the empirical network and less often in the randomized networks, I would say that they are statistically significant for that empirical network. So in this way, they identified 3 node motifs and certain 4 node motifs in several networks. So for example, in the context of biology, they looked at gene regulation, neuronal network and food webs, and they found that both gene regulation and neuronal network have a very frequent occurrence of the feed-forward loop motif, the semi-cycle that I mentioned. They have another pattern which is this what they call the bifan motif, where you have 2 source nodes which are both essentially stimulating 2 sink nodes. And for the case of neurons in particular, they had a biparallel motif also occurring fairly often. Now when you come to food webs, you don't see such feed-forward loops very often, but what you do see is a high preponderance of chains like this. Okay? And you also often have a biparallel where you have essentially a super predator which is preying on two different predators, both of which are essentially preying on the same common prey species. They also did the same exercise for several other kinds of networks. So for example, like electronic circuits, World Wide Web, and so on. And interestingly, they found that the feed-forward loop, which was found very commonly in the case of neural network and gene regulation, also occurs in the case of forward logic chips. So you could infer from this that there's something fundamental about feed-forward loop which makes them very suitable for networks which process information, because that's what these two networks have in common with each other and with these kinds of man-made circuits. Okay? And that's essentially what Alon's group eventually tried to do. They tried to find out what are the functional possibilities of each of these motifs by implementing dynamics on these motifs. Okay, so that essentially was what I wanted to say about network metrics and the macro and micro properties of networks. Let me very briefly tell you about the algorithmic aspects of this network studies, and then I would ask Chandrasekhar to take over to give you the demo. Okay, so the first thing that you encounter when you're trying to analyze network using computers is how do you import or how do you represent the data representing the network in your machine. Okay. So I have mentioned that when we are dealing with a network theoretically, we always represent it as an adjacency matrix. Okay. However, for the applications you may be interested in, an adjacency matrix may not be the optimal representation of the network in terms of usage of computer memory, okay, especially if it's a sparse network. Why? So imagine you are trying to analyze something like the World Wide Web in your machine. Okay. So the number of nodes is enormous. Right? It's just astronomical. Even if you are just thinking of, let's say, all the nodes, all the web pages within a particular geographical region. Okay. So if you are thinking of a network of something like 1 million nodes, okay, I'm just scaling down the scale of the network from the whole World Wide Web to just 1 million nodes. If you want to represent it using an adjacency matrix, we are talking about a 1,000,000 cross 1,000,000 matrix, right? So storing that in your memory may be unfeasible. Okay. Even if it was feasible, it will be very hard to do algorithmic operations with such a huge matrix. So oftentimes the most practical way of representing a network in a computer is not in terms of adjacency matrix, but in terms of an adjacency list. As the name makes it clear, the adjacency list is basically just a enumeration of how many neighbors does each vertex have. Okay? So a simple way of representing adjacency list would be as follows. It could be just represented as each row basically saying which node you're talking about and its neighbors. So for example, this would be an example of an adjacency list. And so on. Okay? So if I want to construct the corresponding network, I can easily do so. So I say that, okay, node 1 has 2 vertices that it connects to, node 2 and node 3. Node 2 has, of course, connection with node 1 as before. It also has connection with node 4 and node 5. Node 3 has connection with node 1, which is already presented, but it also has connection with node 5. Okay. Node 4 has connection with node 2, which is already accounted for, and no other additional links and so on. Okay. So in this way, from the adjacency list, I can easily construct the graphical representation. Okay. So the advantage of using adjacency list is that there are operations which would take extremely less time if you represent the network in terms of adjacency list rather than in terms of adjacency matrix. So one particular operation which it takes much longer in adjacency matrix representation is the neighbor enumeration. Suppose you are just interested to know what are the vertices which connect to a particular node. Okay. Typically that will take order of n operations if you are representing your network in terms of a matrix, but it only takes order of L by n operations if you are thinking of it, if you are representing your network as terms of adjacency list. There is of course an even more efficient way of representing network, and that is the adjacency tree, where you essentially represent your data in terms of a balanced tree. But typically the most popular data storage format, in fact most of the network analysis software uses adjacency list like representations. Okay. Now, I will just give you 3 examples of how do you calculate network metrics. The first is how do you calculate degree distribution. Okay. So suppose you have an adjacency list, so then of course finding the degree of each vertex is trivial. You just go to that list and ask how many entries are there in this particular row. So you find there are 2, then how many entries are there in this particular row? There are 3, and so on. So you basically count, okay, node 1 has degree 2, node 2 has degree 3, node 3 has degree 2, node 4 has degree 1, and so on. Similarly for adjacency matrix, all you have to do is you have to sum up along the row or the column. Okay. Now once you have all the degree of each individual node, you create a histogram. Okay. So for a histogram, what do you have to do? Well, first you have to create bins, and the simplest choice would be you create bins of width unity. So essentially you have bins corresponding to 1, 2, 3 up to the maximum possible degree that a node can have, k max. Okay. And what you do is you go through each node and ask what degree does it have. So if it has, let's say, degree q, then you go to the qth bin and you increment its entry by 1. So initially you start with 0 in all the bins, and you go through each of the nodes in turn, and whenever you find that a particular node has degree q, you go to the qth bin and increase its entry by 1. Okay. So once all the n vertices have been gone through, you essentially get a histogram which corresponds to the probability distribution of k, provided you divide all the entries by the total number of elements. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So let's take this example. Okay. Okay. Let me just write down node 5 is node 2. Okay. So you have this adjacency list. Okay. So the first step would be you ask how many entries are there in the list. So this is 2, this is 3, this is 2, this is 1, this is 1. Sorry? Yeah, so node 2, node 5. Okay, sorry. Yeah, node 5 has node 2 and node 3. Thank you. Okay, so it has a degree of 2. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so you know the degrees. So they are 2, 3, 2, 1, and 2. So how would you construct the histogram? You would say that, okay, let me create an array. What is k max? What is the largest possible degree here? 3, right? Okay. So I could create an arrow. So in principle, I should also have the freedom to have the the possibility of representing disconnected nodes. So that's why I could, if I want, also have a bin corresponding to degree 0, a bin corresponding to degree 1, bin corresponding to degree 2, and bin corresponding to degree 3. So initially, I initialize this array with just value 0. Okay. Then I basically run a loop where I come to the first node and ask what is the degree 2. Okay. So I go to the second to the entry corresponding to degree 2 of this array, and I increment this entry by 1. Okay. So I add a 1 to it, so this becomes 1. Then I come to node 2, I read off the degree, I find it's 3, so I come to the corresponding entry of the array and I increment this by 1. Then I come to node 3 and I find that it's 2, so I come to this one, increment it by 1, so it becomes 2. Then on to node 4, so this has a degree of 1, so I increment this by 1, and finally I come to node 5, so this has a degree of 2, so I increment this by 3. Okay. And now I can divide by the total number of nodes, which is 5. So basically I get P0 is 0, P1 is 1/5, P2 is 3/5, and P3 is 1/5. So this essentially gives me the probability distribution. It's of course a discrete probability distribution corresponding to the degree, for the degree. Okay. Now, one of the big issues with running this kind of algorithm on large networks is that if you choose bin width of 1, oftentimes you would find that your degree distribution looks extremely erratic or jagged. Okay. So I've shown you a few examples of degree distributions computed in this manner, which looks a bit like this. Okay. So you'd prefer to kind of smooth them over. Okay. So you might say that, okay, what if I take larger bins? So instead of considering bins corresponding to degree 1, degree 2, degree 3, I consider bins such that all nodes having degree between 0 to 10, all nodes having degree between 11 to 20, and so on. But the problem with that is that if you have too large bins, then your degree distribution would just look like this. Okay. So you lose resolution. Okay. And the issue is that what is the optimal bin size? What is the optimal bin width to use? Okay. So the moment you are using a bin of any width, you are essentially losing any resolution which is lower than that bin width. Okay. So instead of looking at probability distribution, you can actually look at the cumulative probability distribution, which is the advantage that you can construct a cumulative probability distribution without doing this binning. Okay. Because there's a very nice relation between cumulative probability distribution and rank frequency relation of the data. So the simple solution of this is that you take all the degrees, you sort them in decreasing order. So the first ranked node is the one having the highest degree, the second ranked node is the one having the next highest degree, and so on. So you basically rank all the nodes from 1 to n by this decreasing order, and then you plot this rank divided by n along the y-axis and the degree along the x-axis, and what you get can be shown to be exactly equal to the cumulative degree distribution. Okay. There's a very nice relation which shows that a rank frequency distribution, rank frequency plot shown in this way is exactly the same as the cumulative degree distribution. So the advantage here is that you don't lose any resolution because you are not doing any binning. You have taken each data point and are using its information. Okay. Okay. So on to clustering coefficient. So the local clustering coefficient of a node, as I had mentioned in the previous lecture, is given by the number of pairs of neighbors of a particular node I which are connected divided by the total number of pairs of neighbors of I. Okay. So again, you can, so actually just from the definition itself, it's very easy to figure out how to algorithmically calculate it. So you go through every pair of distinct neighbors of the vertex, and for each pair you ask, are they connected with the edge or not? So you count all such pairs which are connected with an edge, so that gives you the numerator, and the denominator is simply trivial to obtain if you know already the degree ki of the node I. So it simply would be half into ki minus 1, and so you work this out for a local clustering coefficient of a node. If you want the overall clustering coefficient, you basically have to extend this to go over all possible neighbor pairs of all the nodes, and that will give you the overall clustering coefficient. The most non-trivial algorithm of this lot is actually the one you use for calculating path length. And that's because you want a very efficient way of calculating the length of a shortest path going from any node to any other node. It turns out that usually the first thing to use would be a breadth first search algorithm. Now, it turns out that the breadth first search algorithm will give you the shortest path length from a given node to all other nodes of the network. Now, you might ask that, look, for a particular situation, I might be interested to know the shortest path from a particular node to another node. I'm not really interested to know what other path lengths to all the other nodes in the network. But it turns out that there is no other algorithm which in the worst case would perform any better than the breadth first search algorithm, which would give you all the path lengths with all other nodes, regardless of whether you are interested in them or not. So the usual thing is that if you're interested to know what is the path length from this node to this node, you just run a breadth first search algorithm, find all the path lengths from S to all other nodes in the network, and then just throw out all the ones you're not interested in. Okay? And so you just basically start from a vertex S, and initially, of course, all the distances to the other vertices are unknown. So you first find all the immediate neighbors of S. So these would essentially form paths of length 1. So you label each of these vertices. So basically, you have a flag which you basically use to indicate that you have visited these nodes, and then you go over to all the neighbors of these nodes, and sometimes, for example, you may have already visited them because they could also be the neighbor of vertex S. So that's what the flag is for. It's basically to point out that you've already visited them. So if you've already visited them, you don't count them. So you find out all the neighbors of your neighbors which you have not visited earlier. So these would define all the paths of length 2, and so on and so forth. So you just keep going until you find that you have visited all nodes. So the flags of all nodes have been set to the particular value you have set to indicate that you have visited them. And at that point, you have the shortest path length starting from S to all possible nodes in the network. Okay. So I will stop at this point, and I'll ask Chandrasekhar to take over. And as I mentioned, he would actually show how to run some of these algorithms on two of the more popular network analysis software.
Jupyter Notebook or like IPython. How many are familiar with Python? As in like used Python, not just know the name or something. Okay. Anyway, so everything I do will be in the Jupyter Notebook, and I will share the notebook and also the data, so you guys can like try it out later when you're free. So I'll just so Okay, so whoever I'm hoping some of you are at least familiar with this whole setup. Anyway, so, the point is I'll just import the things that are necessary for the whole session. So this is a bunch of libraries, so which doesn't matter if you don't know what they are. Now let's start with a very basic thing. So let's say so we want to construct a network like this. So this is just an image which I basically showed. So it's like I didn't really construct this. So this is an image, just like what 7 nodes, and let's assume that everything that is written on top of it's a directed network. As you can see, there are arrows, and there are numbers written on top of the arrows, which let's consider them as like weights. So it's like a weighted directed network. Okay. How would you construct something like this? So the library which I'm going to make use of mainly is something called NetworkX, which is a very famous graph library for Python. There are a few others like iGraph and stuff, but I'll make use of NetworkX for this session, and it has all the functionality you need to do most of the graph related stuff. So one way to first do is I need to first list out all the nodes that I have. So I basically created a list with the names of the nodes. So the name of the nodes are like A to F. Okay. And the second thing I need to do I'm going to list out all the edges. This is quite non-trivial because what I've done is that to specify if it was an unweighted network, in that case, all I need to say is the source and the sink. I just need to specify this. Since is a director, I have to say from which node to which other node. But since there are weights as well, I have not just specify the source and destination. Apart from that, there's a third value which is indicating the weight. So basically, I create a list of what you call as a 3 tuple, which has 3 values inside, round brackets. So I basically so this is the format in which I need to specify the nodes and the edges. So once I've basically done this, then what do I do? So I create a graph. Since it's a directed graph, I'm going to call it DG. So there's a class of objects called directed graphs, as it's indicating its digraph. Okay, I create one. Then I need to add okay, so let me first create this and then add. See, there are so many things I can add to this thing. One of the option is add nodes from. Okay, select that option and I basically say add nodes from the list I defined already, nodes. Okay, now I need to add edges as well. So see, there's something called add edges from, but we are adding weighted edges. So there's an option called add weighted edges from. So I'll take that. So in principle, I have created the graph. So one way to check whether I actually created the graph is probably to ask you to print out the adjacency matrix. I'll say okay. Probably not the most convenient way to verify whether I've created the graph, but seems believable. Then, so you can get, so once I've created a graph object, I can convert it to many formats. I can get so as you can see in the lecture, you mentioned a lot of formats in which people represent graphs. So if I say in 2 and look, there are people who represent it using a dictionary of dictionaries, dictionary of lists, and they are represented as an array, there's a matrix, there's something called a recurrent array, there's something called edge lists. There are a lot of them. There are sparse matrix representations and but my point is there are so many formats which you can basically represent a graph with. Okay, and they're very easy to convert between each other. Okay, so the next thing is I want to like sort of visualize this thing, visualize the graph, for which so network X itself comes with a lot of visualization tools. So there's a method called the draw network X, which basically draws a graph. So as you can see, the inputs to that function are initially the graph object dg, and I haven't specified where you should keep the nodes. So the position is specified as none. So what here, when you don't specify the position, what it does is it assumes there are springs connected between nodes, and it tries to minimize the energy, and it does some what is commonly known as a force directed algorithm. And that's a very stochastic one, in the sense like if I run it again, the positions might look different, because it's very initial condition dependent. But the point is, it gets the positions from there. I can specify position on my own. Like I can basically tell the xy coordinate for each of the nodes. In that case, it will put them in those places. Then arrows is equal to true because it's a directed network and I want arrows. And forget about the third part, that it's an axis, it's related to plotting. And I want the labels, so I say with labels. Okay. Now the question is, sometimes you might want to highlight like, let's say, you want to show nodes that have larger degrees by larger sizes. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a list of sizes for each node based on their degree. Okay? Because if I do this, simply I'm asking like what is the degree of each of the node, it's basically giving me a list there. So it's like in degree plus out degree, it's not treating it as a directed network. So I want their sizes like, which is like, depend on their, degree. So once I do that, then I can do the whole thing, but just like I have also specified the sizes. Like you see, I'm saying node size is equal to sz, and sz happens to be this list where I've specified the sizes based on their degree. And then of course, I mean, it need not end there. You can do all sort of things. You can just might want to like give it colors. So there's no meaning to any of the colors here. It's just that if I wanted like all the nodes to have different colors or like some particular colors, then you basically create an array or a list which has colors corresponding to each of the node, and you supply it under the option node color, and then you'll have a graph with like nodes with whatever color you want. Okay? And of course, you can specify colors in many formats and so on. Okay, this is the basic, like, if I want to like create like a dummy network like this. But let's say, let me go to this, some real world examples of like a network. So there's this very famous data set, which is, huh? Length of the? No. I mean, well, so it's because of the layout algorithm. So it's connecting springs between them and sort of minimizing energy and stuff. So if something is closer, which means they're, if here it's probably based on the weights. So in some sense, if the weight is higher, then they'll like be closer and things like that. So there it's because of the entire this thing. And the length per se is like, sometimes weight might mean closeness, in the sense like, if they're much strongly connected, you would like to say they're closer in the space where you are trying to visualize. But the distance itself sometimes might have no meaning. I mean, like, weights? You can actually have edge labels. I think so. Typically people avoid that because you can imagine like if I have like thousands of edges, the last thing I want is numbers on top of them. But I think let me see if that's an option.
You can change the thickness of the edge.
Yeah, so, okay. This has some limitations. So I think last time I checked the library, it said you can only specify one number for all the edges, which means I can't have edges of different thickness. But that simply means your life is slightly harder, which means you can still represent it. The way to do it is you take the same axis on which you're plotting, but first split your graph into, if there are like, weights between some, like if there are like weights in the range 0 to 10 or like 1 to 10, get the adjacency matrix of adjacency matrix which has values only 1 and values only 2 and values only 3, and plot one at a time on top of each other. That's one way to get around it. You can do all that, I'm not going to do it, but you can in principle do it, but it's not straightforward. I'm not sure. I don't think they have one for the I don't see an option for edge labels here. The labels by default refers to just the node labels. Yeah. See, it's like you can literally you can do that. It's just that now it means that it's slightly more complicated, because where the location of the nodes are, and it's a straight line between them. What is the midpoint between these 2 points, and you just need to put a text there. So in principle, it's all possible, but it's not straightforward. Okay. In any case, so moving on to more realistic network. So there is this dataset which basically has all the airports in US, and between them, so the 2 airports are connected if there is a direct flight between those 2 airports. And the weights of the edge is just number of aeroplanes flying between those 2 airports, which is a very straightforward way to construct this. So the data set looks like this. So see, this is a sample. So this is a list of each node has a property. You can see here that they have a label which is basically the airport name, the code. I think it probably means the airport code, and then the city where it's located and the latitude, longitude. I don't know what the other 2 are, but a lot of information about the airports here. And then there's another data set which is more relevant if you want to construct a network, which is the data set related to the edges. So which tells you that between these two airports, what is the number of flights? So frequency is the column which represents all the number of flights between these. So how do you construct a network? Some sort of, to construct anything, construct a network, you need to have the list of, first obtain all the list of edges, and in this case it's a weighted network, so you have to get weighted edges in the network. Before that, so what I do is I first get the latitude, longitudes, okay. Then I do a slightly cryptic operation, but people who are familiar with Python, it should be straightforward. What I'm doing is I'm saying there's a column called source and there's a column called target. I'm saying take the column source and take the column target and also take the column frequency, club them all up, so which is done using the operation zip, zips them together, and then make a list of them. So what it creates is like a list of all the weighted edges, and like if I were to display the first 5 edges, it would look like this. It's like 3 tuple now. So this is, if you remember correctly, this is exactly how I separate the list of weighted edges in my first dummy example. But in that case, I had A, B, and C, and those things are the node names. Here, I just basically have this. So once I've done that, so again, so in this case, I'm not creating a directed graph because there's no sense of direction. I mean, well, this can be a sense of direction, but at least the data doesn't have it. Okay. So I'm creating just a simple graph, and I have added weighted edges from this list of edges which I just created. And if I were to see, like, if I just want to ask, like, what are the nodes there, you know, like, just the numbers from 0 to 234. So there are 235 airports here. Okay. So why did I do all this? One, it's very important to know in Network X, when you create a graph, each node will have a dictionary associated with it, which will have all the information about the node. Okay. So I'm checking what is the information associated with the node 0, and it sort of gave me back an empty dictionary, which means at this point in time there is no feature associated with the node. So, but obviously saved latitude, longitude for a particular reason, which is I wanted to, for every node, I wanted to give its corresponding latitude and longitude, so I know where they are located. And then, okay, the last line is something which is basically, if I just do this, there are so many formats I can write the graph to. Okay, there are, like, again, I'm not going to read them, but there are quite a lot of them. And the software which I use for visualization, the Gephi, it prefers GEXF. It has, like, a lot of features which you can add, which I'm not making use of here. But typically when I use Gephi, I use GEXF, but then I can save it in GML, PyEC, like a lot of other formats as well, and it will all be fine. But once I have done this, once I have the graph and I also given the latitude, longitude for each of the node, I've saved them as, like, a file called usair.gexf. Okay. Now what do I do with this? So once I've done that, and okay, it might be of interest to some to see what that file looks like. So if I do this, so it looks like this. If you see, that file basically contains these things. It says edge ID is something, and source is something, target is something, and the weight is something. It's basically that file. Okay. So this is the file. So I load it. So it has 235 nodes, and these are the number of edges. Load it. Why did I use the whole latitude, longitude thing? Because I want those things to be kept on the, as they are on the map. Okay. So first, if I want to simply check the number of connected components, I can just have to click here. It will say there is only one connected component, which is good, because you don't want airports from where you can fly to any other place. So it's like a good thing. Then I use something called a Geo Layout, which puts these nodes according to the latitude and longitude. Okay. And in fact, it's more sophisticated than that, because you can actually use different kind of map projections and stuff. But anyway, so it looks like this. It may not be very convincing. So what I do, I go and let's say, okay, before that, let me again, even here, give them sizes based on, I will give node sizes which are based on their okay. So I will give them sizes based on their degree. So nodes with higher degree simply means busier airports. I hope I did that. So I'll go, I will make this some, so this is how it looks like. So it's now you basically have all the, I hope this looks like US map. So you have a lot of airports with where you can clearly see that the edge have different thickness based on the number of flights that are connecting these two airports, and the edge and the nodes are all put on, like, based on the put on the map based on the latitude, longitude. That's one. That's just quickly how you visualize, and you can save this and stuff, and you can go from curved edges to straight edges, which doesn't look very nice. It looks bad, but and there are a few other things which can play around. You can give the names and all those things, but that is one particular thing. So let me just So does anyone have doubts regarding this? Just this part? This is the whole airport network thing? Okay, cool. So in Gephi mainly there's this set of features called statistics. So as you can see, I ran the average degree thing and it gave me the average degree. And I can also run the average weighted degree. Network diameter, which is the longest path that exists in the map. And there are a lot of other things, page rank, and you can, because you mentioned average clustering coefficient, you can calculate the average clustering coefficient, which is 0.652, which you can notice is pretty high. You can calculate average path length, which is already done, is 2.318, which is reasonable if you think about it. Okay. So now let me go back to some slightly different network. So this is another network which is a pretty famous data set, which is in US they took a lot of political blocks. Each of the block you can label them as democratic or Republican blocks, and then between these blocks they connected a link. If there is an hyperlink in the block X, which on clicking you could go to the block Y. So if you add a link to the block B from block A, then you said there is a link between A and B. Okay? As you can see, it's a very directed network, because having a link from A to B doesn't mean there is a link from B to A. Okay? But all these nodes can be labeled either 0 or 1 based on whether it's democratic or republican, whatever. So this is a famous data set, and people made a lot of interesting points about this network and stuff. So let me just load this data. And this is something which is freely available on Michigan's network database. So there you can get this in the .gml format, and you can see it's just one line to read it in network X, which is nx and .read gml, and you just give the file name and it will read it. And you can check a lot of properties, say you can do this. It will tell you which is the number of nodes, and you can average clustering. Okay. Things are slightly more complicated when it's a directed network, because the definitions for clustering, the way we define here is very different from what is for a directed network. But let me just show some other things. Okay, this is one. Even this might return an error, but let's see. Yeah. So I don't think he has mentioned you what assortativity is, but yeah. So, but I'm saying calculating all these sort of statistics related to graph is very straightforward. It's like as you can see, it has so many. Okay, let's do this. This is probably okay. This is not weakly connected. I mean, people should be able to recognize what this error means. So graph is not weakly connected. So the idea of weakly and strongly connected comes only in a directed graph. Means there is no directed path between all the nodes, all pair of nodes. I mean, in this you can't really find a directed. If you follow through in the direction of the arrows, you might not be able to reach all nodes from a particular node. So in that case, you can naturally see why you can't calculate paths, because in some sense, two things which you can't reach are at an infinite distance. So now we're in the business of sort of averaging a quantity which few of the values might be infinite. So it will throw up an error. You might be able to fix all this by like, just looking for the ones that have a path and stuff, but I'm not going to do that. So quickly, let's just see what this looks like. So this is this is the graph file. This is the directed one I just loaded. Then so what is interesting is, let me color them based on whether they are democratic or like Republican. So so there's something called a partition for the nodes. I go under partition and it says on what attribute. I'm saying value, because values, it has 0 or 1 based on what particular thing is. So now let me apply this. To start off with, they all seem, well mixed, because I have not used any of this thing. But if I use one of the layout algorithms, which will sort of separate them based on, there are many of them. For this purpose, I'll just show one of them. And I also remove things that are isolated, because I know there are a lot of isolated nodes here, which if you have any doubts, you can simply say connected components, and you'll see that there are a lot of isolated, so you want to remove them. So the way to remove is, you go to filter, you say topology, and you say degree range, and then you say, so anything between 1 to 467 I take, anything less than 1, which is 0, I remove them. So I filter, so some of the nodes are gone here. Then I run this. Okay. Then this is another thing which sort of removes the kind of overlapping that exists. Okay. Now if you go back and look at this, you can clearly see that even a simple like sort of layout algorithm, though I didn't, they have the, so the green and red, they are clearly based on their political affiliation. But the point is, a simple layout algorithm is so good at detecting these two groups separately. You can see, that's because, as you can imagine, from a Republican blog, there are more likely to find a link going to a Republican blog than a Democratic one. And the links in between these two big blobs are probably the links that existed. The blogs where you actually found a link, a Democratic blog where you actually found a link to the Republican one, and the other way around. So as you can see here, it sort of like, very, very simply like separates these things into two different sort of modules. I think unless you guys have anything specific to ask, there's not much. I can try. So in the big, that's just you can go there and just export. It's literally just save it in 3 formats you want. There's one more thing, which we had a big network in the beginning, which was I think, we created this network of airports, right, which are 235 nodes. We can quickly, what we can do is like, well, let me do it the hard way. So it gives you like a sort of an dictionary where each of the node is followed by its degree. So let's say that's a legal operation. Okay. So now we have a dictionary which has all this thing. So now let me take k is equal to some okay. So now I just have stored all the degrees in an array, okay, which hasn't gone really well because okay, this is cool. So now we have a list of all these things. So the way you do an histogram, let me just take, what if you did histogram simply by taking everything in just one, like bin sizes were one. So you just say so I'll just say so I'm taking a bin size between 0 and the k max of length of size 1, and this is cheat. Maybe I don't want to do this. Okay, so I do this. So okay, now let me show you how the histogram would look like. This is how it looks like. Okay, so, but as he mentioned, I just wanted to point out the problem with taking bin size 1 is that you can see there are a lot of gaps and stuff. So because there will be like, maybe there are no edges with, no nodes with link, degree 15, and maybe there are 16 and 17. So this is why you should use cumulative distributions and stuff, which are not bin dependent and things. But anyway, between network X, I think if you just use network X, there are so many, literally anything that you want to do with graphs, you should be able to do it just using network X. So I'll share the notebook with the organizers and you can collect it from them. Anyway, thank you.